I want to start a stories. It is very huge and famous stories. In 1956, the Montgomery bus boycott in America, it was more than just a fight for civil rights. It was a deep and powerful expression of people's longing for justice. At its center was Martin Luther King Jr., a young 27 years old pastor. He led a non-violent resistance movement crying out for justice. But his path was filled with pain and threats. One day at 2 a.m., late night, he received a threatening phone call with racial slurs and threats against his family's lives. With an exhausted body and crumbling spirit, he went down to the kitchens and he brewed coffee and sat alone at the kitchen table to pray to God. Lord, I am feeling so discouraged. I do not know if I can continue this work. I feel so alone. At the moment, from the depths of his heart, he could hear the voice of God. Hey, Martin Luther, stand up for justice. I will never leave you. I will always be with you. The circumstance had not changed yet, but his inner self was transformed after he listened to the voice of God. Fear still remained, but God's presence and promise held him fast. A few days later, unfortunately, when his house was bombed, and an angry crowd gathered together and they called for revenge. Hey, pastor, are you gonna do nothing? We have to do revenge for justice. But he stood before the people and said, we will not retaliate. We're not gonna do revenge. We will overcome evil with the love. This is a powerful declaration, right? Actually began. But this powerful declaration actually began not in front of those people, but in that quiet kitchen at dawn. In the moments of communion with God over a cup of coffee. So, communion with God is so important. The dear church, what about us? Do we have such a place, times, and moment in your life? A quiet times and space where no one is watching, but where we are proud our heart before God and listen for His voice. In Exodus chapter 33, we witness something astonishing. Moses speaks with God face to face, as one speaks to a friend in verse 11. Can you imagine that? In the midst of all circumstances, Moses came into the tent and he is talking. He is having time with communion with God. The infinite and holy God making himself known, not in thundering spectacle, but in intimate conversation. This tabernacle became a tent of a meeting, a sacred space where divine friendship is real. There, Moses does not just receive commands, but he shares his fears and pleads for mercy and find courage for the journey ahead. So this is communion. Not a one-sided monologue, but a living, transforming relationship with God. So too often we live burdened by the weight of our responsibility as mom, as a daddy, or as a husband, or as a pastor, as a friend. In the midst of this busy schedule, relationships fatigue and anxiety about the future. Our communion with God becomes smaller and buried and pushed back of our priorities. We tend to do act first, researches, and asking to ChatGPTs and do first. But yet in truth, communion with God is the essential relationship that makes everything else possible. So in today's text, Exodus chapter 33, Moses determines the directions of his life from the center of such communions. So when God declared that he would not go with Israel after the golden calf incident, Moses responded to God, if your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up from here. So this communion is not merely about the act of prayer or attending worship service. It is a journey about acknowledging God in all of life and learning to see through God's eyes and growing in God. So today, as we follow this journey together, we explore how communion with God leads our lives. First, it leads us to live acknowledging God as our Master, Lord. It defines again the relationship God and me. Communion with God is not simply learning about God. It's about placing Him at the very center of our lives. And that kind of relationship is formed through daily practice, through communion. However, we do not really practice it. Why do we so easily forget God? It's not that God has become smaller. It's because our hearts are filled with things we consider more important than God. Filled with things that occupy our thoughts and dominate our emotions and guide our choices. So let me ask you, what occupies the largest space in your heart right now? Be honest with yourself. If it's not God, maybe it's time to return to the place of true communion. Today, so many people try to take proactive control of their lives through self-development. They consider self-confidence and self-determination as the highest values and seeking to become the masters of their own lives. But the Bible shows a different way. Proverbs chapter 3 verse 5 to 6 says, trust in the Lord with your whole heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your path. So, true freedom and real direction in life begins when we welcome God as our master, not when we become our own master. So communion with God is turning our gaze toward Him. A morning prayer, a moment of meditation before His Word, whispered prayer while driving, all these acts are small acts of worship saying to God, you are my master. This is surrendering the sovereignty of our times and heart to God. So today, what moments did you such a confession of God? In Matthew chapter 6 verse 33, Jesus taught, but seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. This verse clearly shows where our priority should be. God first. Placing your God first on your priority list. That is the starting point of communion with God. Moses was an exceptional person. You know what? He was educated from the palace of Egypt. And he wandered the wilderness. And he knows reality and knowledge. He had a leadership and powerful charisma because God shows something. Staff and remarkable wisdom. God made him so wise. But what he relied on was not his own ability. He repeatedly came before God. When problem arose, he went to God. When joyful things happens, he went to God. When they lost their way in the wilderness, when water burst from the rock, when the people complained, Moses, he always headed toward the tabernacle, the place of communion with God. For Moses, living face to face with God was his way of fulfilling his missions. He said that without God's presence, nothing had a meaning. This was not simply religious expressions, but the essence of life that Moses had discovered. Even though God showed so much miracles, 10 diseases to Egypt, and they walked across the rivers and Red Seas. But you know what? Even though something happens, without God, that is nothing. Moses wanted to check he is with God through the communion with God. This is not just only the story of the Moses, but we can see the same story in the David. David showed a similar attitude. In Psalm chapter 27, verse 4, he confessed this. One thing I have desired the Lord, that I will seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. Even with many royal duties as a king, David knew what mattered the most. He knew what was the most important things. Communion with God was the center of his life. What is the one thing you desire most? If you could ask for God just one thing, what's gonna be? The answer will reveal our true priorities. This is precisely why we need communion with God. He is not just our counselor, but our master. And this life of acknowledging and welcoming God as a master naturally leads us to the next stage, experiencing spiritual provision that comes from God. So here, it gives us spiritual nourishment. You know, as a Christians, we use this word spiritual matter, spiritual word, spiritual worship, spiritual belief, and spiritual action, spiritual decision, spiritual something. We often use the word spiritual, right? But do we really know and understand what it means? Here's one way to understand it. A life that starts from my point of view is a worldly life. A life that starts from God's point of view is a spiritual life. So the meaning of spiritual is more than just feeling comfort or gaining strength. It is the ability to see my life through God's eye, to understand what's happening from His perspective, God's perspective. And that kind of understanding only comes from communion with God. So let me ask you, are you looking at your life through your own eyes? What standard do you use to judge success or failures? Happiness or disappointment? And how closely does your standard match God's eyes or God's standards? At the point, Paul in Romans chapter 12, he urges this. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by renewing your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. So this is a process of learning to see through God's eyes. Spiritual life is discerning God's will and living according to His plan and His will, rather than following worldly values and standards. You know what? Today, people try to find the inner peace and direction through meditation, self-reflection, and psychological counseling. While this method may help to some extent, fundamental spiritual nourishment is only possible through communion with God. This is because our soul can find true satisfaction only in relationship with the Creator, our God. So if we do not see the communion with God as important, we will naturally live with worldly eyes instead of spiritual eyes. So they judge what the problem is and what to decide. all from their own perspective. But the judgment is always imperfect because we have been blinded by sin, and our standards, our judgments, always self-centered. Jeremiah chapter 17 verse 9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure." So we cannot fully grasp spiritual truths by our own judgment and wisdom. That is why we need God's revelations and guidance. So have you experienced a change in your perspective on the situation through communion with God? Those who have sufficient communion with God come to know God's perspective well. They identify needs in God's way and interpret situation through God's eyes. Hearing God's voice in prayer and learning God's heart through His words. This is what we call spiritual provisions. Acts chapter 2 verse 42, it shows you what the early church believers. They devoted themselves to the apostle teachings and to fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Despite the persecution at the moments and difficulty in the world, the early church believers received spiritual nourishment through communion with God. As a result, they overcame fear and boldly proclaimed the gospel. Jesus showed us how important communion with God is. Even with the busy ministry during his public ministry, he often went alone to mountain to pray. People had many demands, but Jesus, he found his strength and direction through time with God the Father. How about you? In your busy life, how do you stay connected to Jesus? When your face feels tired or life is overwhelming, what do you really need? The Word offers stress relief, self-management skills and techniques, but only God can satisfy the thirst of our soul. We don't just need a break. We need restoration through communion with God. Those who live with the spiritual provision from God naturally move on to the next stage, the life of growth in God. This is the third blessing that communion with God brings. The last. It leads us on the path of growth. The faith is not simply about staying the same stage. Again, the faith is not simply about staying the same. God wants us not only to believe but also to grow. He desires that we do not remain as children but are encouragingly restored to His image. However, growth is never easy. Growth demands discomfort. It sometimes involves pain and must be endured even times of waiting and misunderstanding. Peter says in chapter 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 18, "But grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ." This growth does not happen automatically, but it happens through continuous communion with God. Many people today they try to grow through self-help books, success seminars, and leadership coaching. While this may be somewhat helpful, true character growth happens in relationship with God. Since we were created in God's image, it's through communion with God that we begin to recover our true nature. Paul also says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 verse 18, "And we all who with unveiled face contemplate God's glory and are being transformed into His image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." So through the communion with God, we increasingly resemble God's image. So I want to ask you today, is your faith growing or has it become stagnant? Close your eyes for a moment right now and reflect on your spiritual journey. How are you different today compared to a year ago or even a month ago? Has your understanding of God's word deepened? Can you stay longer in prayer than before? Are you more able to keep peace in hard situations? Spiritual growth is not just about knowing about Bible verse. It's about becoming more like Christ in your thoughts, in your words, and in your actions. And real growth is not shown when life is easy, but when the life gets hard, in how you respond, in how you love, and how you trust. If communion with God calls us to grow, we should be prepared to boldly let go of things that hinder deep communion. What has hindered deep communion with God in your life? The distractions. Is it busy schedules, endless notifications on your phones, or perhaps excessive obsessions with worldly success? Moses in the tent of meeting, Joseph in prison, Martin Luther King Jr., despite threat, they did not lose communion with God. They were able to grow in any environment because they prioritized their relationship with God. That's why we need deep communion with God. Deep communion with God makes us hear His word again before the situation improves. And that word becomes the strength that changes my attitudes and that makes me walk again even when the situation remains the same. Moses' life was like the same. When he entered the tent of the meeting with God, he experienced God's presence before receiving any answers. That presence enabled Moses to endure, to lead again, and eventually to bring God's people to the promised land. As we shared in the beginning, Martin Luther King Jr., he was also like that. Even when his house was bombed and his life was threatened, including his family. At the moment, his daughter is 16 months or 18 months old. His house was bombed, and so that firing on the door of his house. But he received courage of faith that overcame all fear through the communion with God. That moment at 2 a.m. every night, he brewed coffee and sat on the table and he prayed, God. He poured out everything in his heart. God, I feel lonely. But God is merciful. God appeared to him and answered, I am with you. He was not simply idealist, but a person who grew by practicing the word in the God's presence through the communion with God. Church, we also must grow. And that growth is only possible through communion with God. I sincerely hope that in this place today, you will make a decision to put aside whatever hinders your communion with God and take steps again the journey of truth, spiritual growth. When the word deepens within us and prayer governs us and the habit of being with God transforms our characters and attitude from the weakened to strengthened, from shy to bold. We grow from merely believing people to living people. Not just believing, but live as a believer. This is a true growth that those who commune with God enjoy. And it is God's will for us. So let me conclude today's messages. Dear church, spiritual growth is not optional. It is our calling. God did not save us so that we could simply survive. He called us so that we might thrive, bear fruit, and reflect the image of His Son. If your faith feels stagnant or dry, the answer is not to try harder on your own. Again, listen. If your faith feels stagnant or dry, the answer is not to try harder on your own, but to draw closer to God. Communion with Him is not just a spiritual habit. It is an environment where the transformation starts, begins, and happens. It is where our distorted perspective strengthens and where our tired strength is renewed and where our identity is restored. That was the very experience Moses had in Exodus chapter 33. When he entered the tent of meeting, the pillar of the cloud will descend, and he will speak with God face to face. In that place of communion, Moses did not simply receiving instructions. He received presence. And it was there in verse 13 and 14. And then God made this promise. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. The words of God to Moses and the words of God to Martin Luther King Jr. saying, I will be with you. Even when our circumstance doesn't change yet, communion with God changes. His word, spoken in the quiet of prayer, has the power to shift our hearts, realign our directions, and help us walk again with confidence, with the faith, and with the peace, and with heavenly joy. So, do not be discouraged if growth feels slow. God is patient, and He is at work in you. So take time this week to step away from the noise, lay aside the distraction, and seek God again. Let His presence be your resting place, and His voice your guide. You are not alone. God is with you, and in Him you are growing. Amen.